The rhythmic click of Colby's boots on the asphalt was the only sound that disturbed the quiet of the Toledo apartment complex. 8:42 p.m. on a Tuesday, and most of the residents were tucked away inside, their lives flickering behind drawn curtains. The air, heavy with the lingering dampness of a recent rain, carried the faint metallic tang of exhaust fumes and something vaguely floral, perhaps from a nearby garden he hadn't noticed. He adjusted the brim of his cap, the gesture of familiar comfort in the face of the unknown. The call had come in about a suspicious vehicle, a black Tahoe parked for an extended period near the east wing. Colby's hand instinctively rested near his holster, not from fear, not exactly, but from a lifetime of ingrained caution. He'd seen enough in his years on the force to know that quiet nights could quickly unravel. The Tahoe was exactly as described, its dark form a stark contrast against the pale concrete. No lights, no movement, just a silent, hulking presence that seemed to absorb the ambient light. As he neared, his partner, Brent Wallace, let out a long, weary sigh. Colby could practically feel the waves of boredom rolling off him. Another false alarm, Colby. Probably some kid making out. Wallace's voice was laced with a cynicism that grated on Colby's nerves, even after all these years. He ignored it, his focus tightening on the vehicle. He circled it slowly, scanning for anything out of the ordinary: broken glass, forced entry, anything that might indicate a crime in progress. Plates are out of state, Wallace drawled, the sound muffled as he ran the registration. Colby nodded, a prickle of unease settling in his gut. He tapped lightly on the driver's side window, the sound sharp in the stillness. A moment of held breath, then the window whirred down, revealing a woman with dark, intelligent eyes that held his gaze with unsettling calmness. Her face was framed by loose strands of auburn hair, a few escaping the confines of a messy bun. She looked tired, the kind of tired that settled deep in the bones, but her posture was impeccably straight, her hands resting loosely on the steering wheel. "Evening. You all right in there?" Colby asked, his voice steady, even though something about her composure, her very stillness, felt off. It was the kind of calm you found in a storm's eye, a deceptive tranquility masking a latent power. "Good evening, officer." "Yes, just taking notes." Her voice was soft, with a hint of something Colby couldn't quite place, maybe a faint southern drawl. She gestured to a notebook resting open on the passenger seat. It looked well used, the pages filled with a dense scrawl. Colby peered inside, trying to decipher the writing, but it was a mix of symbols and shorthand he couldn't make sense of. His mind raced, cataloging every detail, every new. The rhythmic pulse of the patrol car's engine idled, a low thrum that vibrated through Colby's worn boots. The late-night air hung heavy and damp, clinging to the asphalt like a shroud. He watched her through the driver's side window, the woman in the parked SUV. She hadn't moved, not even a twitch, since they'd pulled up behind her. Just sat there, hands resting on the steering wheel, illuminated by the faint glow of the dashboard. Something about her stillness unsettled him. It wasn't fear, exactly, but a calculated composure, a deliberate lack of reaction that felt off. Too perfect. His partner, Wallace, let out a long, exaggerated sigh. "Probably just another lost tourist," he grumbled, already fiddling with his phone. Colby ignored him. Experience had taught him to trust that prickle of unease, the subtle discord in an otherwise ordinary scene. He approached the SUV, his hand instinctively hovering near his holster, a habit ingrained after years on the force. He tapped on the window, the sharp rap echoing in the quiet street. The woman startled, her head turning towards him with a swift, almost robotic movement. Her eyes, large and dark, widened slightly before settling into a neutral expression. She lowered the window, the soft whir of the motor a counterpoint to the persistent hum of the patrol car. The air inside the vehicle was thick with the scent of something floral, almost cloying. Colby caught a glimpse of a worn leather-bound notebook resting on the passenger's seat, its pages filled with densely packed writing. "Good evening, ma'am," Colby began, his voice firm but polite. "Can I see your license and registration?" He noted the slight hesitation before she moved, the almost imperceptible tightening of her grip on the steering wheel. What's she thinking? He wondered. Is she nervous or just annoyed? Certainly, officer, she replied, her voice smooth and even. I'm on assignment temporarily. I'm a researcher. Security data analytics. I work with government contracts. She reached into her purse, her movements precise and economical, retrieving a wallet. As she handed over her license and a temporary registration, Colby's gaze lingered on her hands. Long, slender fingers, manicured nails, not a trace of tremor. The license identified her as Talia Monroe from out of state. The temporary registration matched the vehicle. Everything seemed legitimate, yet the unease persisted. He examined the documents closely under the beam of his flashlight, the harsh light reflecting off the plastic. Wallace leaned closer, peering over Colby's shoulder. Anything interesting? He drawled, his tone laced with boredom. Colby shook his head, handing the documents back to Talia. He couldn't articulate what bothered him. It wasn't any one thing, but a combination of factors. Her stillness, her precise movements, the overly polished responses, the closed notebook. He felt like a musician listening to a seemingly perfect melody, only to be disturbed by a single, almost imperceptible note played out of tune. He glanced at the apartment building across the street, its windows dark and silent. What's she really doing here? He wondered. His gut told him there was more to this than met the eye. Everything seems to be in order, Ms. Monroe, he said, his voice betraying none of his inner turmoil. But it's late, and this isn't the safest neighborhood. Just be careful. He could feel Wallace's eyes on him, questioning his prolonged interaction. Thank you, officer, Talia replied, her expression unreadable. She placed the documents back in her purse with the same deliberate movements, her eyes flicking towards the apartment building across the street. For a fraction of a second, Colby caught a glimpse of something in her eyes, a flicker of weariness, a hint of tightly controlled frustration. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the same composed mask. Colby returned to the patrol car, his mind still racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something crucial. Everything okay? Wallace asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. You seemed awfully interested in our researcher friend. Just being thorough, Colby replied, his tone clipped. He started the engine, the familiar rumble filling the silence. As they pulled away, he couldn't resist one last glance at the SUV. Talia Monroe was still sitting there, motionless, her silhouette barely visible in the dim light. The notebook remained closed, its secrets guarded. He felt a pang of guilt, a sense of unease he couldn't quite explain. What if I'm wrong? He thought. What if she's just what she says she is? The thought lingered, a persistent whisper in the back of his mind. He pushed it aside, focusing on the road ahead. He had a job to do, a duty to protect and serve. But the image of Talia Monroe, sitting alone in her SUV, stayed with him, a puzzle piece he couldn't quite fit into the larger picture. He hadn't seen the last of her, he knew it. Something about her, something about the entire situation, felt unfinished, unresolved. He just didn't know what it was, not yet. The city lights blurred past, a kaleidoscope of colors against the dark canvas of the night. The radio crackled to life, dispatch calling them to another incident. Colby sighed, the weight of his responsibilities settling on his shoulders. He pushed the image of Talia Monroe to the back of his mind, but the unease remained, a subtle dissonance in the rhythm of the night. The beam of Colby's flashlight lingered on the rental car's license plate, the out-of-state tag gleaming under the harsh, artificial glow. A knot tightened in his stomach. Something felt off. Not overtly wrong. Not something he could articulate to his partner, Wallace, who leaned against their patrol car, the picture of bored nonchalance. But off nonetheless. He'd seen enough in his years on the force to trust that instinct. The woman, Talia Monroe, remained seated in the SUV, her hands resting calmly on the steering wheel, her gaze fixed on him. An unsettling stillness radiated from her, an almost unnatural composure. He shifted his weight, the leather of his holster creaking softly. I'm going to ask you to step out of the vehicle, Miss Monroe. The words hung in the cool night air, tangible as the exhaust fumes still lingering from their patrol car. Colby really watched her for a flicker of reaction, a tightening of the jaw, a darting of the eyes. Anything, but nothing. Her face remained an impassive mask, illuminated by the dash lights and his own flashlight. The quiet hum of the SUV's engine seemed to amplify the silence. He felt a prickle of unease. Innocent people got nervous. Innocent people fumbled for their license and registration, their hands trembling slightly. They babbled apologies. This woman, she just sat there, a statue carved from moonlight and shadows. "Officer," she finally said, her voice smooth and measured. "Is there a problem?" Her tone was polite, almost conversational, but something about the unwavering calmness in her eyes made him wary. It felt rehearsed, practiced. "Routine check, ma'am," he replied, keeping his voice even, though his pulse had quickened. He could feel Wallace's impatience radiating from across the small parking lot, a palpable wave of annoyance. He ignored it. His gut churned with an unnamed apprehension. Something about the situation, the woman, the unnatural quiet of the night, it all screamed wrong. Inside the SUV, Talia considered her options, each one a tightrope walk across a chasm of potential disaster. Her cover, painstakingly built over months, hung precariously in the balance. The slightest misstep could shatter it, sending her operations spiraling into chaos. These two uniformed officers, stumbling upon her stakeout, were an unwelcome complication, an unpredictable variable in an already complex equation. She took a slow, controlled breath, her gaze locked on Colby. Compliance, for now, was her best play. Antagonizing them would only escalate the situation, potentially drawing unwanted attention to the apartment building across the street, the very target of her surveillance. She unclipped her seatbelt, the metallic click echoing in the confined space. "Of course, officer," she said, opening the car door and stepping out onto the asphalt. The cool night air brushed against her skin, a stark contrast to the stifling tension inside the vehicle. She forced herself to maintain a neutral expression, her muscles tight with the effort. She could feel their eyes on her, assessing, judging. Colby watched as she moved, her actions fluid and graceful, almost too controlled. It was like watching a predator, carefully calculating its next move. His hand instinctively went to his radio. "Dispatch, we need backup. Suspect vehicle, possible out-of-state plates, uncooperative subject." He kept his gaze fixed on Talia, his mind racing. Uncooperative? Not exactly, but something felt wrong. Very wrong. He needed more eyes on the situation, another perspective to either confirm or alleviate his growing unease. Wallace scoffed, his voice low but audible. "Backup? For a routine check? Come on, Colby, the woman's just parked." He pushed himself off the patrol car, his movements sluggish, his expression bored. He clearly didn't share Colby's apprehension. Colby ignored him, his focus unwavering. He could feel Talia's gaze on him, sharp and assessing. He could practically hear the gears turning in her head, calculating, strategizing. The silence stretched, taut and heavy with unspoken questions. The distant wail of a siren cut through the night, a welcome sound that seemed to break the spell. He took a deep breath, the crisp night air doing little to calm the unsettling feeling that gnawed at his gut. Talia's internal monologue was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. The approaching sirens were a complication she hadn't anticipated. Backup meant more scrutiny, more questions. Questions she couldn't afford to answer. Her carefully constructed facade of normalcy was beginning to crack, the strain of maintaining it palpable. She could feel the weight of her concealed weapon against her hip, a cold, hard reminder of the stakes. Her mission, months in the making, hung precariously in the balance. She had to think fast, very fast. "Officers," she said, her voice calm despite the frantic beating of her heart. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding." Her mind raced, searching for a plausible explanation, a way to extricate herself from this increasingly volatile situation. The arrival of the backup patrol car added a new layer of urgency. Colby watched her, his expression unreadable. He could sense the shift in her demeanor, the subtle tightening of her posture, the flicker of something desperation, in her eyes. He felt a surge of adrenaline, a primal instinct to prepare for the unknown. A misunderstanding? Wallace echoed, his tone laced with disbelief. He stepped closer, his hand hovering near his own weapon. You're parked here, in the middle of the night, with out-of-state plates, and you think it's a misunderstanding? The sirens grew louder, the flashing lights painting the scene in alternating hues of red and blue. Time was running out. Talia took a deep breath, steeling herself for what she was about to do. She knew the risks, the potential consequences, but she had no other choice. She had to protect her operation, no matter the cost. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice low and steady, "I'm going to show you something. And then, perhaps, we can clear up this misunderstanding." She reached slowly into her jacket, her movements deliberate, each one a calculated risk. Colby and Wallace tensed, their hands instinctively going to their weapons. The air crackled with anticipation, the silence broken only by the approaching sirens and the pounding of their hearts. The night, once quiet and still, now pulsed with a dangerous energy. The crunch of gravel announced Wallace's arrival. Colby turned, the beam of his flashlight briefly catching the glint of Wallace's badge before settling on his partner's weary face. "Anything," Wallace grunted, already reaching for his own flashlight. Colby could practically smell the stale coffee and lingering cigarette smoke clinging to Wallace's uniform. Another late night, another routine check. They both felt the pull of the mundane, the predictable rhythm of their shifts lulling them into a state of almost hypnotic boredom. Until tonight. Out-of-state plates. Says she's a researcher, but her story's a little thin. Colby held out Talia's license. The plastic felt cold against his fingers, the woman's serene face staring back at them from the small photo. Arizona. What the hell was someone from Arizona doing in a deserted parking lot in their town at this hour? Wallace snorted, taking the license. He squinted at it, the beam of his flashlight dancing across the surface. Arizona? What kind of research requires staking out a half-empty apartment complex at 2 in the morning? He handed the license back to Colby, a flicker of skepticism in his eyes. Colby felt a twinge of unease. Wallace's skepticism was usually a reliable barometer. Colby shuffled his feet, the gravel shifting beneath his boots. He glanced back at Talia, who remained seated in the SUV, her posture relaxed, her hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. She seemed almost serene. Too serene. She says she's on assignment. Works in security data or something like that. Not local. No apartment here. Just sitting in this lot. He hated the uncertainty in his own voice. He hated even more that Talia's composure was making him question his own instincts. Maybe she was just what she said, she was a researcher working odd hours. But something about the situation felt wrong, a prickle of unease he couldn't shake. Security data, Wallace echoed, his tone dripping with disbelief. He ran a hand over his close-cropped hair, a habitual gesture that Colby knew signaled growing irritation. Right, and I'm the King of England. He started towards the SUV, his footsteps heavier, more purposeful now. The shift in his demeanor, the tightening of his jaw, told Colby that Wallace was no longer bored. He was suspicious. Colby trailed behind, his own apprehension growing. He replayed Talia's answers in his mind, searching for inconsistencies, for cracks in her carefully constructed facade. He found none. Her words had been measured, her tone calm. Yet the very lack of anxiety was unsettling. Most people, confronted by 2 police officers in the dead of night, would display at least a flicker of nervousness. Not Talia. She'd met their gazes directly, her expression almost challenging. Wallace rapped on the window, the sharp sound cutting through the quiet night. Talia lowered the window, her gaze shifting from Wallace to Colby. Her eyes, Colby noticed, were a striking shade of green, flecked with gold. They held a depth that seemed at odds with the simplicity of her explanation. "Officers," she acknowledged, her voice low and steady. There was a hint of something else in her voice now, something that Colby couldn't quite place. Fatigue? Resignation? "We're just clarifying a few things, ma'am," Wallace said, his voice firm but polite. The politeness, Colby knew, was a thin veneer. Wallace was a master of the good cop/bad cop routine, and tonight, Colby suspected he was leaning towards the latter. "Could you please step out of the vehicle?" Talia hesitated for a fraction of a second, a fleeting shadow crossing her face. Colby's pulse quickened. That hesitation, that almost imperceptible flicker of something, was the first crack he'd seen. He felt a surge of adrenaline, a sharpening of his senses. He was no longer bored. He was alert, every nerve ending tingling with anticipation. Talia opened the car door and stepped out, the interior light illuminating her face for a moment. She was taller than Colby had expected, her movements fluid and graceful. She wore a simple dark jacket and jeans, her appearance blending seamlessly with the night. She looked like she belonged here, like she was a part of the shadows. "What seems to be the problem, officers?" she asked, her voice still calm, but now edged with a hint of impatience. Colby watched her closely, cataloging every detail: the way she held her hands, the subtle shift of her weight, the almost imperceptible clenching of her jaw. He was looking for tells, for any sign that would betray her carefully constructed composure. "Just a routine check, ma'am," Wallace repeated, his gaze fixed on Talia's face. "We're just trying to understand why you're parked here at this hour." He paused, letting the question hang in the air. Colby could feel the tension radiating off Wallace, the unspoken accusation simmering just beneath the surface. Talia sighed, a soft, almost inaudible sound. "I've already explained to Officer Colby. I'm working." She met Wallace's gaze, her expression unreadable. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by the distant hum of traffic. "Working on what, exactly?" Wallace pressed, his voice hardening. Colby held his breath, sensing the situation teetering on the edge of something unpredictable. Talia's gaze flickered to Colby, a fleeting look that seemed to convey warning. Plea? He couldn't decipher it. She turned back to Wallace, her expression hardening. "I'm afraid I can't disclose that information," she said, her voice low and steady. "It's sensitive." The word hung in the air, charged with unspoken meaning. Colby felt a shiver run down his spine. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this was no longer a routine check. This was something else entirely, something dangerous. The biting November wind whipped around Officer Colby, rustling the dry leaves clinging precariously to the branches of the skeletal trees lining the street. His breath plumed out in ghostly puffs, momentarily obscuring the woman standing before him, illuminated by the flashing blues and reds of his patrol car. Talia Monroe. Her name echoed in his mind, a dissonance against the unsettling quiet of the residential street. Everything about her, the expensive, understated coat, the calm, almost serene expression, felt out of place in this neighborhood, a jigsaw piece forced into the wrong puzzle. He shifted his weight, the leather of his duty belt creaking a counterpoint to the rustle of the wind. Something wasn't right. He couldn't put his finger on it. Not yet, but the unease gnawed at him, a low hum beneath the surface of his professional composure. Wallace, his partner, let out an exaggerated sigh, the sound sharp against the backdrop of the night. "Let's wrap this up, Colby. It's freezing my ass off out here." He jiggled his thermos impatiently, the metallic clink a jarring interruption to Colby's thoughts. Colby acknowledged him with a curt nod, his gaze fixed on Talia. Wallace's impatience was a familiar irritant, a constant reminder of the mundane realities of their job, often at odds with Colby's own need for thoroughness. Tonight, that thoroughness felt more crucial than ever. He addressed Talia, his voice firm but neutral. "I'm going to need to check the inside of your vehicle." The words hung in the air, a tangible shift in the dynamic. He watched for her reaction, a flicker of fear, a hint of hesitation, anything to confirm the suspicions swirling in his gut. Her response was immediate, almost too composed. "On what grounds?" Her voice was level, laced with a cool confidence that both intrigued and unsettled him. Her eyes, dark and unreadable, met his gaze directly. He felt a strange pull, a desire to understand the enigma she presented. Colby hesitated, a fleeting moment of self-doubt. Was he overreacting? Her paperwork seemed legitimate, yet the gnawing unease remained. He ran a hand through his short, cropped hair, the rough texture grounding him. Routine check, ma'am. Just ensuring everything is in order. The lie felt heavy on his tongue, a bitter taste. He wasn't usually one for bending the truth, but something about this situation demanded a deeper look. Talia's expression remained unchanged, the faintest hint of amusement playing at the corners of her lips. Of course, officer. She gestured towards the SUV with a graceful sweep of her hand. Be my guest. The casual acquiescence, the lack of even the slightest protest, only deepened Colby's suspicion. He walked towards the vehicle, his boots crunching on the gravel, the sound amplified in the stillness. He pulled out his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, illuminating the pristine interior of the SUV. It was impeccably clean, almost sterile, devoid of any personal effects. Too perfect. The thought flickered through his mind, a tiny red flag waving amidst the sterile order. He scanned the back seats, the floor, the glove compartment, his movements methodical, each action a silent question. Wallace, leaning against the patrol car, watched with undisguised boredom. Colby could practically hear his internal monologue, a litany of complaints about the cold, the wasted time, the pointlessness of it all. He ignored him, his focus laser-sharp on the task at hand. As he ran his hand along the carpeted floor of the cargo area, he felt it a small, rectangular patch of Velcro, almost flush with the surrounding surface. He pressed on it, his fingers tracing the outline. Something had been here, something recently removed. The realization sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. This wasn't just a routine check anymore. This was something bigger, something more complex than he could have imagined. He straightened up, turning to face Talia, his expression grim. The carefully constructed facade of calm was beginning to crumble, replaced by a dawning comprehension of the situation's gravity. He shone his flashlight on the Velcro patch, the beam highlighting the telltale sign of something missing. What was here, Ms. Monroe? His voice was low, laced with a new authority. Her eyes, previously calm and collected, now held a flicker of something he couldn't quite decipher. Resignation? Annoyance? She took a slow, deliberate breath, the air escaping her lips in a barely audible sigh. Officer, she began, her voice taking on a new, steelier edge. I believe it's time we had a proper conversation. She paused, the silence hanging heavy in the air, punctuated only by the distant wail of a siren. A conversation that you'll probably want to have somewhere more private. Colby felt a cold dread creep up his spine. The casual facade had shattered completely, replaced by an icy professionalism that sent shivers down his spine. He glanced at Wallace, who had finally straightened up, his expression shifting from boredom to bewilderment. The flashing lights of the approaching police cars painted the scene in alternating hues of red and blue, a stark backdrop to the unfolding drama. He had a sinking feeling that this night was about to take a very unexpected turn. He had started with a simple suspicion, a gut feeling that something was amiss. Now, standing on this quiet residential street, the wind whipping around him, he realized he had stumbled into something far deeper, far more complicated than he could ever have anticipated. The pieces of the puzzle were finally starting to fall into place, revealing a picture far more complex and dangerous than he could have imagined. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that nothing would ever be the same again. The beam of Colby's flashlight sliced through the cargo area, illuminating a jumble of innocuous items: a folded blanket, a first aid kit, a half-empty box of granola bars. Dust motes danced in the artificial light, a silent ballet against the dark interior. Colby felt a knot tighten in his stomach. It wasn't what he saw, but what he didn't see. His initial assessment of Talia Monroe, out-of-state researcher, slightly frazzled, probably lost, felt increasingly fragile, like thin ice cracking underfoot. He ran his hand along the carpeted floor, the fibers rough against his fingertips. Something was off. His partner, Wallace, leaned against the bumper, a bored sigh escaping his lips. Nothing but granola bars and good intentions. Colby, let's wrap this up. Wallace's impatience grated on Colby's nerves, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something. Talia stood a few feet away, her arms crossed, her posture rigid. The streetlight cast long shadows, obscuring her expression. Colby had noticed a subtle shift in her demeanor, a tightening around her eyes, a subtle clenching of her jaw. The air around her seemed to crackle with an unseen energy, a silent warning. He returned his gaze to the cargo area, his mind racing. There had to be something. His fingers brushed against a small, rectangular patch on the side panel, almost perfectly flush with the surrounding carpet. Velcro. A ghost of a memory flickered training videos, surveillance equipment, the telltale signs of a hidden compartment. He knelt down, his heart pounding against his ribs. The Velcro patch came away easily, revealing nothing but a clean, rectangular indentation. Empty. The implications slammed into him like a physical blow. A tracker. It had been there, recently removed. Why? Who was she tracking, and why was she so keen to keep it hidden? He felt a chill creep up his spine. This was no ordinary traffic stop. He glanced at Talia, her eyes fixed on him, a storm brewing beneath their surface. He could almost hear the gears turning in her head, calculating, assessing the damage. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he had stumbled onto something much bigger than he could have ever imagined. His initial suspicion had blossomed into a full-blown unease, a sense of impending chaos. Did you have a tracker here? The question hung in the air, thick with unspoken implications. Talia's silence stretched, taut and heavy. Her internal monologue was a whirlwind of frustration and calculation. Damn it. Damn these small-town cops and their by-the-book procedures. Years of meticulous planning, months of painstaking surveillance, all potentially compromised by a routine traffic stop. The tracker, a small, innocuous device, clinging to the side of her SUV, silently feeding information back to her team, was her lifeline, her only connection to the bigger picture. And now it was gone. She had removed it just minutes before the officers approached, a sixth sense tingling, a premonition of trouble. She had hoped to avoid this, to maintain her cover, to complete her mission without drawing unnecessary attention. But now, the carefully constructed walls of her deception were crumbling. She could feel the weight of their gazes, the silent accusation in their eyes. She had to think fast, reveal too much, and she risked blowing her cover, jeopardizing the entire operation. Say too little, and she risked further suspicion, further scrutiny. "I think you should stop now," she said, her voice low and steady, a steel rod beneath the velvet. The words were a warning, a plea, a desperate attempt to regain control of a situation spiraling rapidly out of her grasp. Colby felt a wave of guilt wash over him. Had he made a mistake? Had his assumptions, his ingrained biases, led him down the wrong path? He had been so focused on the surface, on the mundane details of a routine check, that he had failed to see the bigger picture. He had failed to recognize the quiet competence, the steely resolve beneath Talia's calm exterior. He glanced at Wallace, who was now staring at Talia with open suspicion, his hand resting on his holster. The situation was escalating, and Colby knew he had to de-escalate it, and quickly. But how? He was caught in a web of his own making, a web of assumptions and misjudgments. He looked at Talia, her face a mask of controlled emotion, her eyes burning with an intensity that both fascinated and frightened him. He had a feeling he was about to learn a very hard lesson. The air crackled with tension, the silence broken only by the distant hum of traffic and the frantic thumping of his own heart. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the truth, whatever it may be. He owed it to her, to himself, to uncover the truth, even if it meant confronting his own failings. The night, once quiet and predictable, had taken a sharp turn, plunging them all into the murky depths of the unknown. He could only hope they could navigate these treacherous waters without drowning in the undertow. Wallace scoffed, his hand tightening on his holster. Stop what? Stop doing her job? Lady, you're acting awfully suspicious. He stepped closer, his stance aggressive. What were you tracking? Talia's mind raced. She could feel the walls closing in, the net tightening. She had to make a decision, and she had to make it now. She could see the suspicion hardening in Wallace's eyes, the unwavering certainty that she was hiding something. And she was. But revealing the truth, exposing the intricate web of her undercover operation, could have far-reaching consequences, consequences that extended far beyond this small-town traffic stop. She weighed her options, calculating the risks, the potential fallout. Her gut screamed at her to stay silent, to protect her mission at all costs. But another, quieter voice whispered of the potential danger, the escalating tension, the volatile situation that was rapidly spiraling out of control. A single wrong move, a single miscalculation, could have devastating consequences. She closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, a silent prayer for guidance, for strength, for the wisdom to navigate this precarious situation. When she opened them again, her gaze was clear, her resolve hardened. She took a step forward, her voice steady, her words precise. I'm a federal agent. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the aftershock. The biting wind whipped around Colby, tugging at the edges of his uniform. He could feel the cold seeping into his bones, a stark contrast to the simmering tension emanating from the woman in the SUV. He'd seen enough in his years on the force to recognize the carefully constructed calmness, the two still hands gripping the steering wheel. Something wasn't right. He glanced at Wallace, whose impatience radiated in palpable waves. Wallace tapped his foot, a staccato rhythm against the asphalt, his gaze flitting between the woman and the darkened windows of the apartment building across the street. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the distant wail of a siren. Colby churned. He shifted his weight, the subtle movement a physical manifestation of the unease gnawing at him. What was she hiding? Ma'am, I'll need you to step out of the vehicle. Colby's voice was firm, yet he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he was missing something crucial. He watched as the woman, Monroe, finally turned her head, her eyes meeting his. They were dark, almost bottomless, holding a flicker of something he couldn't quite decipher. Resignation? Annoyance? Officer, I've already explained, she began, her voice low and steady. Procedure, ma'am, Wallace interjected, his tone laced with an edge of irritation. He stepped closer to the vehicle, his hand hovering near his holster. Colby felt a prickle of anxiety. He didn't like the way Wallace was handling this. Too aggressive, too quick to assume. He needed to de-escalate the situation before it spiraled out of control. Wallace, a moment, Colby murmured, trying to convey a silent warning to his partner. He turned back to Monroe. We appreciate your cooperation, ma'am. Just a routine check. It'll be quicker if you step out of the vehicle. His words were carefully chosen, designed to soothe rather than provoke. A flicker of something, perhaps amusement, crossed Monroe's face before it was quickly masked. She sighed, a quiet sound that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. Very well, officer. She opened the car door, the interior light illuminating the interior. As she stepped out, Colby caught a glimpse of something tucked into the side pocket of her jacket. Something metallic. His instinct screamed. Wallace, check her pockets, Colby ordered, his voice sharper now. The air crackled with sudden tension. Monroe stiffened, her eyes narrowing. Colby felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He didn't want to do this, but something about the situation felt inherently wrong. He needed to know what she was hiding. Wallace, ever eager to assert his authority, moved towards Monroe. She didn't resist, but the rigid set of her shoulders spoke volumes. Colby watched, his breath held in his chest, as Wallace reached into her pocket. He felt a strange sense of foreboding, a premonition that whatever Wallace pulled out would irrevocably alter the course of the night. Left inside pocket, carefully, Monroe said, her voice barely above a whisper. Colby's unease intensified. Why the specific instruction? What was so important about the left inside pocket? He held his breath as Wallace withdrew a small, leather-bound wallet. It wasn't the weapon he'd expected. Wallace flipped open the wallet, his eyes widening in disbelief. "Oh, hell," he breathed, his voice laced with a mixture of shock and confusion. Colby stepped closer, his heart pounding in his chest. He peered over Wallace's shoulder, and the blood drained from his face. Staring back at him from the open wallet was a gold badge, the letters FBI etched beneath the American eagle. The realization hit Colby like a physical blow. He staggered back, his mind reeling. FBI. This woman, this seemingly ordinary researcher, was an FBI agent. All the pieces of the puzzle suddenly clicked into place. The carefully crafted composure, the reluctance to leave the vehicle, the cryptic instruction about her left pocket. It all made sense now, and the weight of his mistake settled heavily on his shoulders. He looked at Monroe, her expression unreadable. The silence stretched, broken only by the sound of the wind. Colby felt a wave of shame wash over him. He judged her, questioned her, treated her like a suspect. And all the while, she had been working undercover, likely on a case far more complex and dangerous than anything he'd encountered in his years on the force. His assumptions, his prejudice, had nearly jeopardized her operation. The thought churned in his stomach, a bitter taste of regret. Wallace, still stunned, fumbled to close the wallet. His face was pale, his usual bravado replaced by a look of bewildered uncertainty. Colby knew he was feeling the same weight of realization, the same pang of guilt. They had both misread the situation, blinded by their own preconceived notions. Colby cleared his throat, the sound raspy and strained. He looked at Monroe, searching for the right words, the words that could somehow bridge the chasm of misunderstanding that had opened between them. But what could he say? How could he possibly apologize for the insult, the suspicion, the sheer arrogance of his actions? He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He swallowed, trying to regain his composure, his thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and self-recrimination. He had been so focused on the surface, on the seemingly innocuous details, that he had completely missed the bigger picture. He had allowed his own biases to cloud his judgment, and in doing so, he had nearly compromised a potentially vital operation. The implications of his actions weighed heavily on him, a crushing burden of responsibility. He looked at the apartment building across the street, the darkened windows suddenly seeming ominous, hiding secrets he couldn't even begin to fathom. He thought of the meticulous planning, the hours of surveillance, the risks Monroe had taken to get to this point. And he, in his ignorance, had almost ruined it all. The thought was a sharp stab of guilt, a reminder of the delicate balance between duty and assumption. The wind howled, a mournful sound that seemed to echo the turmoil in his heart. He looked at Monroe, her face illuminated by the flickering streetlight. He saw the weariness in her eyes, the subtle lines of tension etched around her mouth. He saw the strength and the vulnerability, the weight of the burden she carried. And he understood, finally, the true meaning of her silence. It wasn't defiance, it wasn't deceit. It was the silence of someone who had seen too much, who had carried too much, who had learned to trust no one. And in that moment, Colby felt a profound sense of shame, a deep and abiding regret for the assumptions he had made, for the judgment he had passed. The cool night air, thick with the scent of exhaust and damp asphalt, pressed against Colby's skin. The woman, Talia Monroe, stood bathed in the flickering glow of the streetlight, her composure unsettling in the face of their questioning. He replayed her initial responses in his mind, the slight hesitation before each answer, the almost imperceptible tightening of her jaw. Something felt off, a discordant note in the otherwise mundane melody of a routine check. His partner, Wallace, shifted impatiently, the beam of his flashlight dancing across the brick facade of the apartment building opposite them. "So, Ms. Monroe," Wallace's voice dripped with skepticism, "care to elaborate on what exactly you're researching at this hour?" Talia's gaze, previously fixed on a specific window of the building, flickered towards Wallace. A fleeting shadow, A ghost of frustration crossed her face before her expression smoothed into a professional mask. Colby saw it, a flicker of something deeper, something she was trying to conceal. She's hiding something, he thought, his gut tightening with unease. But what? Officer, Talia began, her voice calm, but laced with an underlying tension that mirrored his own growing suspicion. I understand your concern. This situation requires a bit more context than I initially provided. She paused, her eyes darting back to the apartment window, a mix of anxiety and calculation swirling within their depths. She's weighing her words, Colby realized, measuring the risk. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the low hum of the SUV's engine and the distant wail of a siren. Context. Wallace scoffed, his hand resting on his holster. Try the truth, lady. Loitering in a parked car at 2 a.m. with out-of-state plates screams suspicious activity. And your story about researching architectural details? Don't insult our intelligence. Talia drew a deep breath, her shoulders rising and falling in a barely perceptible sigh. Colby could almost feel the weight of whatever she carried, a burden heavy enough to bend her spine but not break her spirit. Officers, she said, her voice dropping to a low, urgent murmur. I am Special Agent Talia Monroe, Federal Bureau of Investigation. And I'm watching a known associate of an arms trafficker who launders money through real estate fronts. That apartment, she nodded towards the building, is one of them. The words hung in the air, heavy and charged, detonating the carefully constructed facade of a routine stop. Colby felt a jolt of adrenaline surge through him, his hand instinctively moving towards his own weapon. Wallace, his face a mask of incredulity, let out a low whistle. FBI? Seriously? He stepped closer, scrutinizing Talia's face. You expect us to believe that? Talia's eyes, dark and intense, met his unwavering gaze. I can show you my credentials, she said, her voice steady despite the tremor of frustration Colby sensed beneath the surface. But right now, every second counts. I've been tracking this operation for 6 months. 6 months? Colby echoed, his mind reeling from the sudden shift in the situation. 6 months of surveillance, and he swallowed hard, the realization hitting him with the force of a physical blow. We just blew her cover. He looked at the apartment building, the innocuous windows now imbued with a sinister significance. He imagined the eyes watching them, the wheels turning, the plans changing. Officer Colby, Talia's voice was sharp, cutting through his spiraling thoughts. Did you run my plates through NCC? Yes, ma'am, Colby replied, his voice strained. Came back clean. He could feel the heat rising in his cheeks, shame and guilt battling with the rising tide of adrenaline. That's because they're flagged for federal covert operations, Talia explained, her voice tight with suppressed frustration. Standard procedure, designed to avoid exactly this kind of interruption. Wallace, finally processing the situation, let out a string of curses under his breath. He paced back and forth, the beam of his flashlight slashing across the street, his agitation palpable. So, he finally stopped, turning to Talia. You just compromised a 6-month federal investigation because we were doing our damn jobs? Talia's face was pale in the streetlight, the exhaustion she'd been masking now evident in the lines etched around her eyes. She closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering her composure before meeting Wallace's accusing gaze. Officer Wallace, she said, her voice weary but resolute, you didn't compromise the investigation. We did, collectively, because we all made assumptions. Her gaze shifted to Colby, a flicker of something akin to understanding in her eyes. Your caution is understandable, but sometimes the greatest threats hide in plain sight. The air thrummed with a sudden tension, a shift in the atmosphere that prickled Colby's skin. He scanned the street, his senses on high alert. Something felt wrong, a subtle change that he couldn't quite place. The distant rumble of an approaching engine broke the silence, growing louder with each passing second. He exchanged a look with Wallace, a silent acknowledgement of the escalating danger. This isn't over, he thought, his gut clenching with a premonition of what was to come. This is just the beginning. The cool night air, tinged with the metallic tang of exhaust fumes and the faint sweetness of blooming jasmine from a nearby garden, pressed against Talia's skin. She held the sat phone tight, the cold metal a stark contrast to the rising heat of frustration that coiled in her gut. Her gaze, seemingly casual as it swept over the street scene, missed nothing. Every shadow, every flickering light in the apartment block opposite, every passing car, each detail imprinted itself on her mental map, a landscape she'd meticulously charted over weeks of painstaking surveillance. 3 weeks, she thought, the number of bitter taste on her tongue. 3 weeks of living out of this Tahoe, surviving on lukewarm coffee and gas station sandwiches. For what? To have 2 uniformed officers stumble upon her stakeout like a pair of clumsy, overeager puppies sniffing at a hornet's nest. Agent Monroe. The gruff voice of her sace crackled through the sat phone speaker. Report. Officers Colby and Wallace, PD, just conducted a routine check. They were satisfied with my explanation, she said, the words carefully neutral. Internally, she winced. Satisfied wasn't the word she'd use. Suspicion still clung to them like a second skin, tight and uncomfortable. She'd seen it in the way Colby lingered, the way Wallace's hand hovered near his holster even as he offered a dismissive nod. They were like bloodhounds that hadn't quite caught the scent, but knew something was off. Anything else? The Sace's voice was edged with impatience. He never had time for the nuances, the subtleties of field work. He wanted facts, evidence, arrests. He didn't understand the agonizing slow burn of long-term surveillance, the constant pressure cooker of maintaining a false identity while living under the shadow of discovery. There's a man walking a dog, Talia reported, her voice flat. The man in question was a block down, a nondescript figure in a baseball cap, his movements seemingly aimless. But Talia's instincts, honed over years in the bureau, screamed caution. Something about the rigidity of his posture, the way his gaze flicked towards the apartment building, then back to her, felt wrong. He just circled the block twice, she added, her gut clenching. A sigh, heavy with weariness, escaped her lips. Sir, the cameras, she began, her voice tight with the unspoken plea. The surveillance cameras, she'd meticulously positioned her only lifeline in this solitary operation. Her only means of gathering evidence were, now, a potential liability. If the arms trafficker, Anton Volkov, or one of his associates caught a glimpse of the officers interacting with her, they might suspect a connection. Her cover would be blown. The entire operation, weeks of painstaking work, would crumble into dust. The Tahoe strategically placed, sir, she continued, her words measured, each syllable imbued with the weight of her frustration. I can't be compromised. Not now. The placement of the SUV, seemingly haphazard, was anything but. It provided a clear line of sight to Volkov's apartment while offering a degree of concealment. It was her shield, her fortress, her prison. Silence hung heavy on the line. Talia imagined her Sace, sitting in his sterile office, miles away, shuffling papers and sipping lukewarm coffee, oblivious to the tension radiating from her, the cold fear that was slowly creeping into her veins. Monroe. The Sace's voice finally cut through the silence, sharp and urgent. We've got a breach. They saw you 2 walk up. Talia's breath hitched. The world seemed to tilt, the familiar street seen warping into something strange and menacing. They saw. The 2 simple words reverberated in her mind, each syllable a hammer blow against the fragile structure of her operation. She closed her eyes for a split second, fighting the wave of despair that threatened to engulf her. Opening her eyes, she forced her voice to remain calm. Confirmed, sir. They saw the interaction with the officers. Affirmative. Volkov's inside. We have eyes on him. He's on the move. The man with the dog was now directly across the street. He'd stopped walking, the leash held loosely in his hand, his gaze fixed on her. The casual facade had vanished, replaced by a chilling intensity. The dog, a large Doberman, whined low in its throat, its ears pricked, its body tense. He's not alone, Talia whispered into the sat phone, the words barely audible above the pounding of her heart. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She wasn't just being watched. She was being hunted. The situation, already precarious, had just escalated into something far more dangerous. Her carefully constructed world, her meticulously crafted identity, was fracturing around her. The game had changed, and the stakes had just gotten infinitely higher. The cold night air suddenly felt suffocating, closing in on her, a tangible manifestation of the trap she was caught in. She was alone, exposed, and the hunter had become the hunted. The hum of the idling SUV filled the otherwise silent street, a low thrum that vibrated in Colby's chest. The woman, Monroe, stood bathed in the harsh glare of his patrol car's headlights, her face an impassive mask. Her earlier composure, which he had initially taken for innocence, now felt like a carefully constructed facade. Something prickled at the back of his neck, a feeling he'd learned to trust over his years on the force. It wasn't fear, not exactly, but a heightened awareness, a sense of the world tilting subtly off its axis. He glanced at Wallace, whose usual boredom had morphed into open suspicion. Wallace shifted his weight, the leather of his holster creaking in the night. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the distant drone of city traffic. Colby could feel the weight of unanswered questions pressing down on him, heavy and suffocating. He dealt with enough evasive witnesses and nervous suspects to know that something wasn't right. "So, Ms. Monroe," Colby began, his voice rougher than he intended, "you mentioned waiting for a colleague?" Monroe's eyes, dark and unreadable, flickered towards the apartment building across the street. The faintest of sighs escaped her lips, a sound that spoke of weariness and something else Colby couldn't quite place. He found himself wondering about the lines etched around her eyes, the subtle tension in her jaw. She looked like someone carrying a burden too heavy for one person to bear. "He was supposed to deliver something," she said, her voice low and even. "Evidence." Colby exchanged a look with Wallace, who rolled his eyes almost imperceptibly. "Evidence." Of course. This was turning into a textbook case of something bigger than it appeared. He felt a familiar knot tighten in his stomach. These were the situations that kept him up at night, the ones where the seemingly mundane could spiral into something dangerous and unpredictable. "Evidence," Wallace echoed, his tone laced with skepticism. "What kind of evidence?" Monroe hesitated, her gaze fixed on the building opposite them. The streetlights cast long, distorted shadows, transforming familiar objects into something sinister and unknown. Colby felt a sudden chill despite the warm night air. He could practically hear the gears turning in Monroe's head, weighing her options, calculating the risks. He wondered what she was seeing that he wasn't, what secrets lay hidden beneath the surface of this quiet, residential street. "Information," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "about an arms trafficking operation." The words hung in the air, heavy and charged with an unspoken tension. Colby felt his breath catch in his throat. Arms trafficking. This was no longer a simple parking violation. His hand instinctively went to his holster, the familiar weight of his weapon a small comfort in the face of the sudden, unsettling shift in the atmosphere. Wallace straightened, his eyes widening slightly. The boredom was gone, replaced by a sharp, almost predatory focus. "Arms trafficking?" Wallace repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. "Here? In this neighborhood?" Monroe's eyes finally met his, a flicker of something that might have been amusement, or perhaps just resignation, in their depths. "They're everywhere," she said, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. "You just don't see them." A sudden movement caught Colby's eye. The man with the dog, the one they'd seen earlier loitering near the apartment building, was walking away, his pace brisk and purposeful. He disappeared around the corner, swallowed by the shadows. Colby's pulse quickened. He'd seen that look before, the look of someone trying to escape unnoticed. He glanced back at Monroe, a sudden realization dawning on him. Had she been watching him all along? Was this somehow connected to her evidence? "That man," Colby said, pointing in the direction the man had disappeared. "Do you know him?" Monroe's face was unreadable, but a muscle twitched in her jaw. "He was the courier," she said, her voice tight. "The drop." "Drop?" Wallace asked, his voice sharp. "The exchange," Monroe clarified, her gaze fixed on the empty street. The information was supposed to be passed on tonight. A cold dread settled in Colby's stomach. He had a sinking feeling that their routine patrol had just stumbled into something far more complicated and dangerous than they could have imagined. He could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on him, a heavy, suffocating blanket. He'd been so focused on the mundane, on enforcing parking regulations, that he'd missed the bigger picture. He'd missed the signs. "He's gone," Monroe said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's likely scrubbed. They'll pull out before sunrise." Her words were a stark reminder of the stakes. They weren't just dealing with a parking violation anymore. They were dealing with a potential arms trafficking operation, and their actions, or rather, their inaction, had just compromised everything. He could feel the guilt gnawing at him, a sharp, persistent ache. He should have seen it. He should have known. He glanced at Wallace, whose face was pale and tight with a mixture of shock and dawning comprehension. The implications of Monroe's words were sinking in, heavy and inescapable. The quiet residential street suddenly felt charged with a dangerous energy, the air thick with unspoken threats. The hum of the idling SUV, once a mundane background noise, now seemed to pulsate with a sinister undercurrent. The night, once quiet and peaceful, now felt pregnant with danger. The beam of Colby's flashlight danced across the peeling paint of the dumpster, the metallic tang of stale garbage heavy in the night air. He ran a gloved hand along the rough brick wall, a nagging unease prickling at the edges of his awareness. Something felt off. Talia Monroe, or Agent Monroe as she'd later identified herself, had seemed almost too composed, too resigned. He'd seen that look before, the weary acceptance of someone carrying a burden far heavier than they let on. The kind of burden that etched lines around the eyes and tightened the corners of the mouth. He shifted his weight, the leather of his holster creaking softly against his thigh. Wallace had already retreated to the patrol car, the rhythmic tap of his fingers on the steering wheel a testament to his impatience. Colby could practically hear his partner's internal monologue, a litany of complaints about wasted time and pointless procedures. But Colby couldn't shake the feeling that something was still unraveling, a thread pulled loose from a tapestry he couldn't quite see. He circled the dumpster again, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. A flicker of movement near the bottom caught his eye. He crouched down, pushing aside a pile of overflowing trash bags, the stench hitting him in a wave of sour decay. And there it was, a nondescript black duffel bag, tucked away as if someone had tried to conceal it in plain sight. His pulse quickened. He reached for his radio. "Wallace, I found something." The tapping stopped abruptly. "What is it?" "Another stray cat." The sarcasm crackled through the speaker. "Negative. Looks like a bag. Possibly discarded evidence. Need you to secure the perimeter." His voice was clipped, professional. He wasn't sure what he'd found, but instinct told him it was significant. A sigh. "Fine. But if it's another bag of dirty diapers, I'm writing you up." The sound of the car door opening reached Colby, a reluctant counterpoint to the pounding of his own heart. He carefully pulled the duffel bag out from behind the dumpster, setting it on the cracked pavement. It was heavier than he expected, the canvas straining against its contents. He unzipped it slowly, the metallic rasp echoing in the stillness of the night. Inside, nestled amongst layers of foam padding, were several laptops and a collection of USB drives. His breath caught in his throat. This wasn't discarded evidence. This was something else entirely. Something bigger. He thought back to Agent Monroe's face, the tight control she'd maintained throughout their encounter, the exhaustion that shadowed her eyes, the quiet desperation in the way she'd gripped the steering wheel of her SUV. Suddenly, pieces began to fall into place. The carefully cultivated air of normalcy, the subtle but persistent surveillance she'd been conducting, the apartment building across the street. It all pointed to one thing, an operation. And he, in his by-the-book diligence, had just stumbled right into the middle of it. He pulled out his phone, his fingers trembling slightly as he dialed the number Agent Monroe had given him. It rang twice before she answered, her voice low and guarded. "Yes. Agent Monroe," he began, the words catching in his throat. "I think you missed something." A beat of silence, then a sharp intake of breath. "Where are you?" He described the location, the duffel bag, its contents. He could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, rapid and shallow. "Stay put," she commanded, her voice laced with a tension he hadn't heard before. "Don't touch anything else. My team will be there in 5. Colby hung up, a wave of nausea washing over him. He had no idea what kind of operation Agent Monroe was running, but the sudden urgency in her voice told him it was serious. He'd gone from a routine patrol to potentially jeopardizing a federal investigation in the space of an hour. He closed his eyes, the weight of his actions settling heavily in his chest. He judged her, dismissed her, based on assumptions and preconceived notions. He'd seen a suspicious vehicle and a woman who didn't quite fit the picture of a late-night researcher, and he'd acted. He'd followed procedure, yes, but had he truly seen? Had he truly understood? Wallace sauntered over, his expression a mix of curiosity and annoyance. "So what's the big deal?" "Lost luggage." Colby opened his eyes, the image of the laptops and USB drives burned into his mind. He looked at his partner, at the casual indifference in his stance, the dismissive curl of his lip. The words felt thick and heavy in his mouth. "I think," he said slowly, "we just walked into something much bigger than we thought." The silence that followed was broken only by the distant wail of a siren, a harbinger of the storm that was about to break. The night, once quiet and uneventful, was now charged with a palpable tension, the air thick with unspoken questions and the heavy weight of consequences yet to unfold. Colby stood there, the beam of his flashlight casting long, distorted shadows against the brick wall, his mind racing, his gut twisting with a knot of apprehension. He'd made a mistake born of ignorance and assumptions, a mistake that could have far-reaching implications. He just hoped it wasn't too late to fix it. He looked towards the approaching sirens, their flashing lights painting the night sky in alternating strokes of red and blue. And in that moment, he understood. He understood the burden Agent Monroe carried, the weight of responsibility, the constant vigilance. He understood the silent battles fought in the shadows, the sacrifices made in the name of duty. He understood, finally, that sometimes the most dangerous threats are the ones that hide in plain sight, masked by the ordinary, concealed by the everyday. And sometimes the most unlikely heroes are the ones who stumble upon them, armed with nothing but a flashlight and a nagging sense of unease. The crisp night air, thick with the metallic tang of recent rain, clung to Colby like a second skin. He watched the apartment building, a monolithic shadow against the bruised twilight sky, his gut twisting with a knot of unease. The SUV's door clicked shut, the sound abnormally loud in the sudden quiet. Talia Monroe stood there, a silhouette against the weak glow of the street lamp, the same unsettling calm etched on her face. Her reappearance sent a ripple of apprehension through him, a stark contrast to the simmering frustration he'd felt just moments ago. He couldn't shake the image of the bag's contents, the glint of metal, the cold efficiency of the tools. Tools of a trade I never wanted to understand, he thought, the realization settling heavily in his chest. He'd seen enough in his years on the force to know what those tools implied. Wallace shifted beside him, his impatience a palpable presence. "So," he grunted, his voice laced with skepticism, "got a reasonable explanation for all this, Ms. Monroe?" His tone, sharp and accusatory, grated on Colby's already frayed nerves. He knew Wallace, knew the way his partner's mind worked, jumping to conclusions, filling in the blanks with the darkest shades. "It's easier to condemn than to understand," Colby mused, the thought a bitter echo of his own internal struggle. Talia's gaze swept over them, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. "The bag," she began, her voice low and steady, "contained evidence." She paused, letting the words hang in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Evidence I've been gathering for months. Each word felt carefully chosen, measured, as if she were weighing the consequences of revealing even this much. Colby felt a surge of something akin to shame. He'd treated her like a suspect, a criminal, when she was the one fighting the real fight. A fight I almost jeopardized. The thought punched him in the gut, a sharp reminder of his own blunder. Evidence of what? Wallace pressed, his arms crossed, his stance defensive. Colby could practically hear the gears turning in his partner's head, still searching for a way to fit this woman, this situation, into a neat, easily labeled box. He wants a simple answer, a clear-cut villain, Colby realized, but life rarely offers such clarity. Arms trafficking, Talia replied, her voice flat, devoid of any emotion. The words landed like a bombshell, detonating in the silence. Colby felt a cold dread creep up his spine. Arms trafficking. Here, in their city, under their noses. He'd always known it existed, a shadowy undercurrent in the fabric of society. But to have it confirmed, to have it laid bare right in front of him, was a different matter altogether. He glanced at the apartment building, the innocuous facade, now masking a sinister reality. "In your—" Wallace began, his voice trailing off, a hint of disbelief coloring his tone. He looked at Talia, then back at Colby, his eyes questioning, searching for confirmation, for reassurance. "FBI," Talia answered, producing her credentials, the small, metallic badge glinting in the dim light. The silence that followed was thick with tension, heavy with the weight of unspoken accusations and apologies. Colby felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him, a weariness that went deeper than the long shift. We were so close to ruining everything, he thought, the realization a heavy weight in his chest. He'd been so focused on the immediate threat, on the perceived danger, that he'd missed the bigger picture. He'd allowed his assumptions to cloud his judgment, his prejudice to blind him to the truth. Talia's gaze, sharp and piercing, met his. "You didn't ruin this," she said, her voice surprisingly gentle. But tonight was a reminder. She paused, her eyes fixed on his, her words hanging in the air like a challenge. "Not everyone who looks like a threat is one." Her words resonated with Colby, striking a chord deep within him. He'd seen it countless times, the quick judgments, the snap decisions based on appearance, on background, on preconceived notions. He'd been guilty of it himself, more times than he cared to admit. It's easier to label than to understand, he thought, the realization a bitter pill to swallow. He'd let his own biases influence his actions, his own fears dictate his response. Talia continued, her voice low and steady. "Ask yourself if it's because they're a threat or just because you can't explain them." Her words hit him like a physical blow, forcing him to confront his own ingrained prejudices, his own unconscious biases. She's right, he admitted to himself, the thought a painful but necessary truth. He'd judged her, condemned her, based on nothing more than circumstance and appearance. He'd allowed his own limited perspective to shape his perception of reality. The night seemed to hold its breath, the silence punctuated only by the distant hum of traffic. The weight of the situation pressed down on Colby, a heavy blanket of regret and self-recrimination. He looked at Talia, a flicker of understanding dawning in his eyes. He'd learned a valuable lesson tonight, a lesson about assumptions, about judgments, about the hidden complexities of the world around him. He learned that sometimes the greatest threats are the ones we can't see, the ones we create ourselves through our own biases and fears. The apartment building loomed in the background, a silent testament to the hidden dangers lurking beneath the surface of everyday life. And as Talia turned away, disappearing back into the shadows, Colby knew that the lesson she'd taught him would stay with him long after the night was over. A lesson etched not in ink or blood, but in the quiet weight of his own conscience.